Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are welcoming our Outstanding Faculty Achievement Award winner, Dr. Sarah Fields, here to give us our talk today. And I'm going to hand it over to Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Pamela Jansma.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Outstanding Faculty Achievement Award for 2021. Glad that you're joining us today for what promises to be an engaging exploration of morality at the intersection of social media, sports celebrity, and corporate sponsorship. Dr. Sarah K. Fields was the recipient of the Outstanding Faculty Achievement Award for 2020 after 3 years as a professor in the Communication Department and a stint as Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning. She received her Juris Doctorate from University and her PhD from the University of Iowa. She previously taught at Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Georgia, and Ohio State, the Ohio State University, for those of you who know that it's the, which I think is probably all of us at this point know it's the Ohio State University. Her research and teaching focuses largely on the intersection of sport and American culture, specifically examining issues of gender, injury, and law. She is the author of 2 books, Game Faces, Sports Celebrity and the Laws of Reputation, which came out in 2016, and Female Gladiators, Gender, Law, and Contact Sport in America, which appeared in 2005. Love of sport is in Dr. Fields' blood. She was one of the first girls to play organized soccer in the St. Louis metro area in the 1970s, and she's played soccer for, we won't say how many years that is, 40 years. She is a devoted enthusiast of curling, and she even took the entire dean's office staff out to a curling lesson in the times before COVID. To know Sarah is to know her fierce sense of justice, her wicked sense of humor, and her devotion to education. Bonus points if you can guess which athletes her pets are named for. She currently has 2 cats named Scurry and Solo and a dog named Marshall. It is my pleasure to introduce the outstanding Sarah Fields.
Can't hear you. Need to unmute. Uh-oh.
Do I have to unmute you?
Oh, let me try. I need to unmute you, I think. Where is she? Sorry, everybody. Technical glitch.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Sorry, guys. That's my bad.
Tracy, I think I'm going to have you make me a co-host so I can share my screen.
Yeah, I thought I did that. Let me do that right now.
We are good. Okay. So that was smooth. Thank you, Pam, for that introduction. Thank you, Tracy. Wrangling technology on Zoom, as we all know at this point, is terrible. I want to thank all of those of you who are attending today, because I know that you got up this morning and said, you know what, I want to spend another hour on Zoom today. That will make my life better. It has been a rough couple of weeks or after a rough couple of months, and I do appreciate your showing up. All of this said, I think we can all agree that this would be a lot more fun if we were live. Karen Fennell would have organized snacks. You'd be sitting there thinking, you know, this cookie is pretty good. Halfway through my talk, you'd be thinking about that last chocolate chip cookie. You'd be wondering why the provost is out in the hallway taking the chocolate chip cookies. You'd be paying very little attention to me. But I appreciate your showing up because it's kind of fun to chat about this latest research project. I'm focusing a little more on race. Also, I need to give a disclaimer. I am not great on Zoom. I am way better in person. I'm charming in person. I'm witty in person. I'm taller in person. I'm much better looking. I'm a lot funnier. And I also always wear pants when I'm in person. So with that, let me turn to more serious issues. So this is a story about Richard Mendenhall, who was a player in the National Football League, and he joined Twitter in early 2011. His profile said he was a conversationalist and a professional athlete. He is, as well, an African-American man. Now, his Twitter profile probably helped land him an endorsement deal in 2008 with Champion. Champion is a subdivision of Hanes Brand Incorporated. I'm going to call them HBI throughout this talk. And HBI, Champion, think of them interchangeably. Now, Richard Noll was the CEO of HBI when Mendenhall was signed and throughout his tenure with HBI. Like most Fortune 500 CEOs, Richard Noll was male and white. In all likelihood, Champion's initial attraction to Mendenhall was because he was a professional athlete. But it was Mendenhall, the conversationalist, that created a real problem when he published a series of short tweets after the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011. The Twitter and media backlash led to HBI's decision to cut ties with Mendenhall, and they said that his online comments violated the morality clause of his contract. Mendenhall took the company to court over whether his comments were a violation of the clause, and more broadly, over whether the corporation could claim sole responsibility for defining morality. As luck would have it, the case was heard by one of the relatively few African-American male federal district court judges. So I'm not a huge theorist, but I think it's important for you all to understand what frames my thinking as we talk about this case and why I think it's important to understand the people involved. If 2020 taught us anything, it is that race in America is a constant issue, even if many particular white Americans have ignored that issue. But the law has been equally guilty of ignoring race, and the law has pretended that justice is colorblind. So critical legal studies is a school of legal philosophy that first appeared in the 1960s, and it argued that something called legal determinacy was wrong. Legal determinacy says that every judge presented with the same facts and the same legal precedent is going to reach the same decision. Now, critical legal studies scholars said no. Judges are influenced by what today we would call their lived experiences. Critical legal studies scholars argued that judges made decisions that the judges believed correct based largely on their own personal ideology, and then they simply found legal precedents to justify their decision. Now, over the last 50 years, theorists have continued to expand on that basic premise that a lived experience matters. So, critical race theory has argued since the early 1970s that racism is a constant in the US and as such must be constantly interrogated and challenged. Intersectionality theorists remind us that we have more than one identity, which impacts how we perceive the world and how we are perceived. Further, Abram X. Kendi has argued that not only is racism a constant in society, but our own laws and policies must be constantly examined and rewritten for their own racist tendencies and interpretations. So, weighing the various identities of the parties involved in court cases is really critical to understanding how an outcome transpires. Where does sport fit into this? Sport is one of the largest cultural influences in the US, so it's worthy of consideration. In the late 1980s, sports studies scholar Susan Burrell called for theorists to take radical action. She suggested that they pay attention to the role of race and gender in sport. Later, Burrell and Mary McDonald expanded on this idea and argued that examining sporting narratives is a way to explore the intersection of identities in culture at large. And I do want to acknowledge that even though I'm going to focus largely on race, just as white privilege is present in this case, so too is male privilege. In fact, all of the major players in the story are male, because at the time, 3/4 of the federal judiciary was male, 90% of the Fortune 500 CEOs were male, and there was only one woman among the top 50 highest paid athletes in the world in 2011. Guys got the endorsements, just like guys got the judgeships and the CEO positions. So using the Mendenhall lawsuit as a case study, I want to argue that in order to build a more equitable and just legal system, we need judicial involvement of people with a wide diversity of lived experiences to avoid simply defaulting to the majority white perspective. So let's start talking about the people involved. Rashard Mendenhall was born in 1987, and he grew up in the Chicago suburbs, just to the north of the city. He loved football. His mother, though, was a youth minister who was deeply committed to education, and she supplemented the young Mendenhall's schooling by sending him to special programs where he learned African and African-American history. As a kid, in addition to football, he really liked to write, and in high school, he fancied himself quite the musician and song lyricist. He credits his mother with instilling confidence within him and with teaching him the importance of a well-rounded education in life. But his fame came through football. As a junior running back in 2007 for the University of Illinois, he was named the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year, and he led his team to the Rose Bowl. The Pittsburgh Steelers selected him with the 23rd pick in the 2008 draft. His rookie season, the team won the Super Bowl, but he was on injured reserve, but he still got a ring. 2 years later, the Steelers again played in the Super Bowl, and this time Mendenhall was the starting running back. He was the game's leading rusher, and he scored a Pittsburgh touchdown, but he fumbled the ball at the beginning of the fourth quarter. The opposing team picked up the ball, scored, and ultimately won the game. Pittsburgh fans neither forgot nor forgave. But Mendenhall was really more than a football player. He never hid his intelligence or his thoughtfulness. He felt the weight and consequences of being a cerebral athlete. Discussing his experience at the NFL Draft Combine years later, he reported that one team expressed concern that he simply read too much. And even the Steelers' public relations team, when they were interviewing him for their blurb, said he needed to pick a book other than the autobiography of Malcolm X as his favorite book. And so, as you can see on the screen, Mendenhall would talk about the challenges of being a thinking athlete and the burdens of being a Black athlete and balancing everything with a life and the Hall of Fame goal. And his role as what he called a conversationalist reflected his own lived experience, and the dense issues that he often addressed were really more than what most football fans wanted. And this complexity is what confounded things in May of 2011, when Mendenhall joined the national conversation about the death of Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. So on May 1st of that year, President Barack Obama announced that the US military forces had killed bin Laden almost a decade after the 9/11 hijackings, which had resulted in the collapse of the trade towers, the crash into the Pentagon, and the crash into the Pennsylvania field. Many in America and on Twitter celebrated bin Laden's death. Later polls would indicate that 93% of Americans approved of the killing, with some 80% using the words thrilled or happy about his death. Crowds gathered that night after the president's announcement to celebrate in New York City, the District of Columbia, as well as other cities, where they chanted USA, USA, as if it was a football game. Newspaper headlines the next day were, as you can see, almost universally supportive of the military action, which had resulted in bin Laden's death. The next day, May 2nd, 2011, Mendenhall joined the Twitter conversation with a series of tweets asking philosophical questions and offering his own perspective. For example, part of his series read, "What kind of person celebrates death? It's amazing how people can hate a man they never even heard speak. We've only heard one side. For those of you who said we want to see bin Laden burn in hell and piss on his ashes, I ask you, how would God feel about your heart? I believe in God. I believe we're all his children. And I believe he is the one and only judge." And then in a tweet that was deleted, but of course captured in screenshots and retweeted, he wrote to someone saying, "We'll never know what really happened. I just have a hard time believing a plane could take a skyscraper down demolition style." As you can imagine, Twitterverse responded to Mendenhall's posts. Some reacted specifically to bin Laden's death and expressed disappointment that Mendenhall was suggesting celebration was not the most moral response. Others responded to Mendenhall's questioning of the 9/11 attacks themselves. In these remarks, he at least implied acceptance of those conspiracy theories that the towers were destroyed by pre-placed explosive devices rather than the impact of the planes. Some tweets questioned Mendenhall's intelligence and referred back to his fumble in the 2011 Super Bowl. Who cares what an ignorant football player thinks? Mendenhall's biggest offense was that damn fumble. Others seemed to question who Mendenhall really was. Richard Mendenhall sounds like a terrorist, with stick figures of lines and dashes shrugging. Now, that terrorist comment might have been a joke, but we all know that discerning humor on social media is a challenge. That same comment might have been to say who knows really about Mendenhall's patriotism or his loyalty to the US. And one other response I read is a death threat. RIP Mendenhall, you just officially signed your own death certificate with those comments. Now, Mendenhall was not alone in expressing theological concerns about celebrating bin Laden's death. On the day of the death announcement, the Vatican released a statement saying, quote, "While Christians do not rejoice over a death, it serves to remind them of each person's responsibility before God and man. Osama bin Laden, as everyone knows, had the grave responsibility of having spread division and hate among people, causing the deaths of an innumerable number of people and exploiting religion for those purposes," end quote. I can find no evidence that Twitter responded to the Vatican statement, which is similar to Mendenhall's question about how God would feel about celebrating death. The Vatican, of course, though, is expected to have and to articulate more nuanced views about theology and justice than a mere football player. Now, it's important to remember that the response to Mendenhall's tweet series is not universally opposed. A number of them supported him or suggested that he raised important questions. Responding to his tweets were things like, "At first I was upset about your tweets, but like your goal, it got me thinking. Mad respect for you, man. Love a man of God. Appreciate your thought-provoking tweets. It's time people stop living a selfishly blind life. I've never been a Steelers fan, but I have more respect for you than any other professional athlete I can think of. Your mental state should be the prototype not just for athletes, but for humans in general." On May 3rd, the day after Mendenhall posted his tweets about bin Laden and 9/11, Art Rooney II, the white male owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, released a somewhat condescending statement. I will read that statement, and I will try very hard not to read it in my Thurston Howell III voice. "I have not spoken with Richard, so it is hard to explain or even comprehend what he meant by his recent Twitter comments. The entire Steelers organization is very proud of the job our military personnel have done, and we can only hope this leads to our troops coming home." In the end, though, neither the Steelers nor the NFL levied any punishment upon Mendenhall for his tweets. Now, despite the support that he got on Twitter, on May 4th, Mendenhall clarified his tweets in his blog. In that blog, he insisted he did not support terrorists, he did not hate America, and he did support the troops. He reiterated that he was simply questioning the morality of celebrating death. He added that his tweet was, quote, "in response to the amount of joy I saw in the event of a murder. I don't believe that this is an issue of politics or American pride, but one of religion, morality, and human ethics." He quoted Ezekiel from the Bible and added, quote, "I wasn't questioning bin Laden's evil acts. I believe he will have to face God for what he has done. I was reflecting on our own hypocrisy. During 9/11, we watched in horror as parts of the world celebrated death on our soil. Earlier this week, parts of the world watched us in horror celebrating a man's death," end quote. He concluded again that he wanted to make people think. But his clarification did not appease his corporate sponsor. So let's go back and talk a little bit about how Mendenhall and HBI connected in the first place. Right after the 2008 draft, before his rookie season, Mendenhall signed what's called an endorsement or talent agreement with Champion, again, Champion subdivision of Hanes brand HBI. The contract was for 3 years, and both sides seemed excited about the relationship, and both sides suggested that part of his appeal was his intelligence and his willingness to address difficult issues. His agent said, quote, "We felt that Champion was an ideal fit for Richard because of their brand and message that embodies his personality as well as his athleticism. In addition to his passion about his family and friends, he has a great interest in and appreciation for the arts, including both music and writing." A Champion executive said, "Richard's interest and sense of play extends beyond athletics, which make him approachable for our consumers and reflects what Champion is all about." All seems well. And in fact, one component worth noting is that the original endorsement deal signed in 2008 did in fact have a clause for termination that today, or well, actually we've always called it a morality clause. The original contract said HBI could void the agreement without penalty if, quote, "Mendenhall is arrested for or charged with or indicted for or convicted of any felony or crime involving moral turpitude." Okay, every word in that sentence is easily definable. So from a legal perspective, this is clear and simple. And morality clauses in employment and endorsement contracts first gained popularity in the US back in the 1920s, largely because of questionable behavior by actors, one actor in particular. Roscoe, Fatty Arbuckle, a silent screen star and comedian in the early part of the 20th century, had been a really highly paid studio star when he was arrested for rape and murder charges in 1921, just after signing a 3-year, $3 million contract with the studio. Without a morality clause, the studio was on the hook for the contract and for the continued relationship after he was ultimately acquitted after his 3rd trial. During the Red Scare and the McCarthy era of the 1940s and 50s, studios were allowed to terminate deals with employees suspected of being connected to the Communist Party. And in fact, in 1954, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the legality of morality clauses. And they concluded that refusal to answer questions before a congressional committee about communism could be grounds for termination under a morality clause. Starting in the 1980s, they appear regularly in coaches' and athletes' contracts, particularly in endorsement contracts, and they remained common. Now, the relationship between Mendenhall and HBI was positive throughout the original contract, so much so that the two renegotiated the deal in 2010 and they agreed to extend the contract term until 2015. So they made the deal early, they extended it and increased the amount of pay. He was going to get $1 million, which was more than the original contract. But both parties also agreed to change the language of the morality clause. And the new language said that HBI could terminate the relationship, and I'll quote pieces of it, if Mendenhall commits or is arrested for any crime or becomes involved in any situation or occurrence tending to bring Mendenhall into public disrepute, contempt, scandal, or ridicule, or tending to shock, insult, or offend the majority of the consuming public. HBI's decision on all matters arising under this section shall be conclusive. Now, the new morality clause language is way broader and way more vague than the original language. Under the original language, HBI gets to fire Mendenhall only if he's legally tied to a felony or something involving moral turpitude. Under the new language, he can be fired for behavior less than criminal as determined solely by HBI, a Fortune 500 corporation dominated largely by white leaders. So when Mendenhall tweeted his original thoughts on May 2nd, the day after bin Laden was killed, it took a few days for HBI to respond. Mendenhall clarified his tweets in the blog on May 4th, and on the following day, May 5th, HBI notified Mendenhall's agent that they were invoking the morality clause and terminating their relationship. But on May 6th, HBI sent a statement to ESPN explaining their decision. And that statement said, in part, Champion is a strong supporter of the government's efforts to fight terrorism and is very appreciative of the dedication and commitment of the U.S. Armed Forces. Earlier this week, Richard Mendenhall, who endorses Champion products, expressed personal comments and opinions regarding Osama bin Laden and the 9/11 terrorist attacks that were inconsistent with the values of the Champion brand and with which we strongly disagreed. While we respect Mr. Mendenhall's right to express sincere thoughts regarding potentially controversial issues, we no longer believe that Mr. Mendenhall can appropriately represent Champion, and we have notified Mr. Mendenhall that we are ending our business relationship. After some back and forth, Mendenhall sued HBI in July of 2011. Now, HBI is not itself without some controversy. The company works hard to have a wholesome image, comfortable cotton clothing, all of that. They hire famous celebrity spokespersons who are often in the world of sport, and that includes Michael Jordan, one of their bigger endorsers. But they'd run into morality issues with a prior endorser when they hired white actor Charlie Sheen in 2008. This before he was winning, but not before he said other things. In 2006, Sheen had, like Mendenhall, questioned whether the 9/11 towers collapse was caused by something other than airplane strikes. But Sheen hadn't tweeted his questions. Sheen had appeared on Alex Jones' InfoWars in 2006, and he said that he doubted that 9/11 terrorists could have done what they did, and he preferred the theory of a setup. But despite Sheen's prior statements, HBI not only hired him, but they paired him in commercials with Michael Jordan. It was only after Sheen was arrested and charged with felony menacing and domestic violence against his wife on Christmas Day in 2009 did HBI invoke the morality clause in his contract. Now, on the labor front, HBI had also had some poor public relations moments. So, for example, in 2010, the company closed a facility in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, among many, many other facilities that they closed nationwide, and they laid off 240 workers in that area. The next year, the facility reopened, but with only 60 employees. But to add salt to the wound, the company chose not to hire from those who had been laid off the year before. Instead, they hired 30 temporary employees, and they brought in 30 additional employees from other facilities. In total, Richard Noll, the CEO, closed over 30 plants and fired 15,000 people while moving production outside of the US. For this, his board of directors rewarded him with lots and lots of money, roughly $5 million a year, plus my personal favorite, a $40,000 a year car allowance so he could get around, presumably driving away from people that he was firing. So, goes to court, and it's filed in the Middle District of North Carolina in the federal court system because HBI's corporate headquarters were in Winston-Salem. And Judge James A. Beatty Jr. heard the case. Judge Beatty, African-American man. He had been raised in South Carolina by his aunt and her husband. He was an active kid who, like most kids, at one point got in some trouble. In one story, he and some friends at the age of 6 had found matches and were playing with them and accidentally set fire to an abandoned house outside of town. The boys, including Beatty, were brought before a white judge who threatened them all with jail, but instead gave them a stern lecture. In 1963, he was in 8th grade, and he and his friends, inspired by the civil rights sit-ins that they saw on television, decided that they too needed to be activists. So they went to a local segregated cafeteria and tried to get service. They backed down when they were confronted with violence and a shotgun. That same year, as an 8th grader, Beatty gave a speech at school about democracy in America and told his teachers that he might want to be a lawyer. He was among the first group of students to integrate the public white schools in Thomasville, South Carolina. He played high school football in one of the first integrated schools. He got a football scholarship to Western Carolina University. After graduating, he got his law degree from the University of North Carolina in 1974. At that point, he moved to Winston-Salem, where he practiced law, until 1981, when he was elected a county superior court judge. In addition to his legal and judicial work, Beatty was active in the local Winston-Salem community. He served on the board of directors of the Big Brothers Big Sisters and the Salvation Army clubs. As a father, he volunteered for the Boy Scouts. He coached youth football. He was a deacon at his church. His experiences suggest he was a well-rounded, intelligent, thoughtful man committed to integration and to improving his community. And the world took notice. In 1994, he was appointed to the Federal District Court of the Middle District of North Carolina by President Bill Clinton. Now, during Clinton's election campaign, he had promised to appoint more women and people of color to the federal bench. And at that moment, Beatty was drawn both into a lifetime of federal service and into a political morass. Fortunately, his nomination to the Federal District Court was without opposition. Like all federal court nominees, his appointment had to be confirmed by the Senate. So he drove up to Washington, D.C. and appeared before the Judiciary Committee. That appearance was brief. He gave his opening statement. He thanked the Senate. He talked about his wife. He talked about his son, and he answered the one question that he was asked. And then the confirmation was closed because the senators really wanted to hear Nelson Mandela speak. So they finished up and left. Senator Jesse Helms, the North Carolina senator on the committee, didn't even show up. He just sent this nice note of support, and Beatty was confirmed in October of 1994 by a unanimous voice vote. So Senator Helms' support of Beatty in 94 is important because the Senate had a rule that a senator from the state where the judicial appointment was being made could block a nomination and prevent it from even having a committee level hearing. In December of 96, a couple of years later, President Clinton nominated Judge Beatty to fill an empty seat on the then all-white Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And this time, Helms blocked Beatty. The backstory surrounding resistance to Clinton's attempts to appoint a black man to the all-white court was shockingly political and racially charged. In 1991, George H.W. Bush was president, and he nominated this conservative white district court judge named Terrence Boyle to the open seat on the court. Terrence Boyle was a former aide to and a current friend of Senator Helms. But the Democrat-controlled Senate never acted on the nomination. I know we all know how this works these days. Senator Helms was a noted segregationist and a racist, and he supported Boyle's nomination, and he was not happy that it had been blocked. When Bush lost his re-election campaign to Clinton, Helms, for some reason, expected Clinton to reappoint Boyle to the position. But instead, there were now 2 positions open on the Fourth Circuit, and Clinton named a white lawyer and Judge Beatty to those 2 seats. Helms wasn't happy with either nomination because he was still mad that Boyle, his friend and aide, wasn't on the court, so he blocked both appointments. In 97, Clinton renominated Beatty. He gave up on the other guy, and Helms stopped it again. So race, politics, and power all likely played a strong role in Helms's resistance. Although Helms might have been personally loyal to his former employee, his conservative ideology and his white race were really probably just as, if not more, important to Helms. It wouldn't be until 2001 that the first African-American jurist would join the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and it would not be James Beatty. And these are the experiences of the judge who would hear Mendenhall's case. So let's talk law. The key to Mendenhall's breach of contract lawsuit against HBI is that morality clause. To win his lawsuit, Mendenhall needed to prove that his tweets on May 2nd about the bin Laden killing and his allusion to the conspiracy theorists surrounding 9/11 had not brought him into public disrepute, contempt, scandal, ridicule, or shocked, insulted, or offended the majority of the consuming public. HBI filed a motion on the judgment of the pleadings. That means simply, they said, the judge, you have all the evidence you need to render a verdict on behalf of us, the defendants. There's no need for a full trial. And their argument was pretty simple in part. They said the final sentence of the morality clause said HBI got to make the decision on all matters regarding this clause, that it's conclusive. Mendenhall's counter argument was that HBI had hired him to be himself, that the company knew the kinds of stuff that he tweeted about when they extended the contract, and that the termination of the deal was a violation of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, which is implied in every contract. Mendenhall's argument was that if the final sentence was valid and the company really could decide what violated the morality clause solely at its discretion, then the company had to be reasonable about its decisions, and Mendenhall didn't believe they had been. In 2012, Judge Beatty rejected HBI's motion for judgment on the pleadings, and he ordered the case to go to trial. He noted explicitly that Mendenhall never questioned the legality of the morality clause. He questioned its application. The judge agreed with Mendenhall that HBI's interpretation and enforcement was in fact bound by the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, so the company could not act arbitrarily, irrationally, or unreasonably. The point that Judge Beatty found worthy of further consideration was HBI's conflicting statements to Mendenhall and to ESPN about the termination of the endorsement deal. When HBI told Mendenhall's agent the deal was being revoked, the company specifically referred to the morality clause, which implied that the company found Mendenhall's tweets to have shocked or insulted the majority of the consuming public. When HBI released its statement up to ESPN, though, it explicitly stated that the deal was terminated because the company disagreed with Mendenhall's comments. And that attitude is not grounds to end the business relationship under the terms of that particular contract. So Beatty also rejected HBI's alternative argument that the statement to ESPN was completely irrelevant because Mendenhall had offended the majority of the consuming public. To support this position, they offered tweets, news reports, articles, which were all critical of Mendenhall's comments to support that position. Now, Mendenhall's team, of course, countered that narrative with other tweets and other communications which supported Mendenhall, and they argued that he hadn't offended the majority of the consuming public. So, quite reasonably, the judge concluded this to be a contested fact, which would need to be determined by a jury. So HBI had another argument. They argued that the termination was justified even without the tweets and news articles because Mendenhall had admitted he posted the tweets and that he got negative attention from those who disagreed, and so much so that he felt compelled to clarify his comments in the blog. Beatty agreed that Mendenhall had admitted to all of this, but he noted that Mendenhall never said that he had offended the majority of the consuming public. That would have triggered the termination clause. So he dismissed HBI's motion for judgment on the pleadings and ordered the case to trial. That trial never happened. The two parties reached an undisclosed settlement in January of 2013. Legally, Beatty's decision to send the case to trial reaffirmed the assertion that the good faith component of a contract is really critical in morality clause enforcement. But some scholars questioned if the decision went far enough. They thought Beatty could have been more explicit in his ruling without going to trial. Legal scholar Todd J. Clark argued that Judge Beatty, quote, failed to render a decision that reflects the value of an athlete's thought-provoking or political speech, particularly when an athlete is a member of a marginalized population, end quote. Clark would have preferred that Beatty had directly concluded that HBI had violated the implied obligation of good faith and fair dealing in terminating Mendenhall. He added, in sifting through this evidence, the judge would have processed it by evaluating it through its own frame of reference. Although this approach seems reasonable, it has the potential to be biased substantially in favor of white judges' conceptions of morality, which may not always coalesce with the moral conceptions of other groups, end quote. Clark believed that in this case, this African-American judge could be trusted to keep in mind the role of race, but a white judge might not be able to step out of their white privilege. Race is particularly relevant in this case because of the very question of who is the majority of the consuming public. That's a question fraught with racial tension. The phrase majority of the consuming public was never clearly defined in the contract. Does that mean the majority of all Americans who could purchase Champion or HBI clothing? Was it the majority of the world's population which could be purchasers? Was it the majority of those who had actually bought the stuff? How do you measure this? Obviously, HBI expected that it'd be impossible to define the phrase or to measure it because the contract gave the company the sole right to make that determination. Clark also has expressed concerns about giving such power of morality determination to corporations. He noted that the white-run corporations had brought the 2008 economic collapse on us, and now we were about to give them the power to determine morality. He also feared that white purchasing power would sway corporations to define morality in ways that would align with white consumers, adding that, quote, because wealth corresponds to purchasing power, corporations will be inclined to evaluate morality in a manner that most closely resembles the United States' primary customer, white Americans. Professor Tony Lester concurred with this sentiment. In an analysis of the Mendenhall decision, Lester agreed that the answer to how many tweets represented a majority was impossible to answer. Lester suspects that future morality cases might revolve around both sides hiring pollsters to try to define morality, but fears that that could miss the cultural relativism of a situation. As evidence, Lester pointed to a 2011 ESPN poll, which concluded that 57% of African Americans thought that the media unfairly criticized Black athletes compared to white athletes, although only 7% of white fans agreed with that perspective. Lester used this poll as evidence to support a call for what Lester called a cultural defense, which would require that courts in morality clause cases consider the context of the lens of the event through the lens of the parties involved. This proposed standard acknowledges lived experiences of the parties. Now, legal scholars might disagree with the judge's decision not to simply render a verdict in favor of Mendenhall, but many were rightly convinced that race is an important part of the case. Although the language in the morality clause might appear to be race neutral, the application was anything but. A white-run corporation had set itself up to be the arbitrator of morality. Now, the theoretical layers that inform this conversation suggest that allowing that white-run corporation to determine morality is wrong. American society is too complicated and too diverse to allow a single race, a single gender, a single anything to determine morality or law. So where are we now? Everybody in the case has obviously moved on. Judge Beatty was honored with his portrait in a courtroom when he announced his retirement in 2018 after 23 years on the federal bench. His wife, his son, his daughter-in-law, and his grandchild were all present for the unveiling. But today, African-American judges remain in the minority on the federal bench, as do all judges of color, who comprise in total only 20% of sitting judges and 27% of active judges. According to recent data, 10% of sitting judges and 13% of active judges are African-American. Latinx judges are 7% of sitting and 9% of active judges. Asian Americans make up only 2.5% of active judges and 4% of sitting judges. And Native American and multiracial judges combined make up less than 1% of the federal judiciary. Richard Noll, the white CEO of HBI during the Mendenhall relationship, retired from the company in 2019. He earned millions, usually between $5 and $7 million every year. Even when he transitioned to be just the chairman of the board and was no longer CEO, he received over $500,000 a year. He made a lot of money for himself and he made a lot of money for HBI. Sales jumped by about $2 billion a year. They even made money when Mendenhall was a spokesperson. But in terms of racial diversity and on the CEO level, it's bad. Effective at the end of this month, we will be down to 4 Black CEOs at Fortune 500 companies in total. Now, Rashard Mendenhall has proven that there is life after the NFL. After 5 seasons in Pittsburgh, he signed a deal with the Arizona Cardinals as a free agent in 2013. He played 1 season for the team, and then in the middle of his contract, at the relatively young age of 26, he retired. He wanted to be a writer. And not surprisingly, given his willingness to speak for himself directly, he skipped the usual retirement press conference and he explained his decision in his blog. He said he'd been successful as a football player, but he found it difficult that the public would not accept that he was more than a football player. He loved the game, but he loved other things. He didn't want to be an entertainer, which is what he thought the NFL players had to be. He worried about the physical impact on the game, on his body, and said he didn't want to risk his body for the sake of entertainment. He expressed frustration with not having a private life while being in the public eye, and he felt resentment that people felt comfortable calling him to his face in public dumb and using racial slurs. After he retired, he worked for the HBO series Ballers. He became a writer for that series, and he continues to work in Hollywood today as a writer, producer, and director. He had his own production company. He remains active on social media. He posts clips of his workouts. He comments on theological issues. He continues to engage those football critics who are still mad about that fumble in the Super Bowl. He offers tweets and comments about African-American history, literature, and art. He is, as always, the complicated, multi-talented man that Champion hired to sell t-shirts. He remains the same confident conversationalist who asked America to think about what it meant to celebrate death, even the death of a terrorist. Now, the law around athletes and social media and even morality clauses, frankly, remains unclear. A number of college and professional sports leagues have limitations, if not bans, on athletes participating on social media. They limit when, where, and what the athlete can post. They have people monitoring social media to make sure that the athletes abide by the rules. They'll sanction players who violate team or league rules. And athletes accept these limitations so that they can play. Professor Clark proposed that when it came to the enforcement of morality clauses, the burden of proof should be shifted. The athlete, or rather the plaintiff, in this case the athlete, should have to show that the speech was protected speech, and then the defendant, in this case the HBI Corporation, would have to show how the speech harmed the endorsement relationship or the corporation, which in theory would free the athlete to speak about important public matters and not be bound by the bias of white consumers, courts, or corporations. Other scholars have proposed a nexus test in which the company would need to make an explicit connection between the alleged misconduct and the product or the company before dismissing someone. In theory, that might be a way to protect free speech. But this is a story in which race is a critical subtext, which needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be moved to the fore. Critical race theory says that race is always present, as it is here. HBI hired a white truther in Charlie Sheen and it fired a black one in Mendenhall. HBI wanted Mendenhall to represent their brand, but they didn't really want him to think and to express his thoughts. They wanted a quiet athlete who, if he had deeper thoughts, would not share them on Twitter. When he tweeted something controversial, HBI couldn't handle it. Would he have been fired if he'd been white? Maybe. But Mendenhall himself wrote about the overt racism, racial slurs, and the implicit racism, don't acknowledge that Malcolm X is your hero, that he faced as a black professional athlete. HBI's executive whiteness and its arbitrary power over a black employee is consistent with its corporate priorities based on profitability and assumed popular white opinion. HBI had a white male CEO at the time, and at this present, there's no evidence they've ever had a non-white male CEO. Further, Noll, the CEO, had a history of doing neoliberal things that harmed people of color that were good for business, because that's what CEOs do. In one example, he pushed the Obama administration to stop Haiti from raising its minimum wage from 24 cents an hour to 61 cents an hour because HBI had a clothing production factory in Haiti. But this story is a little different. Mendenhall really won by getting to go to trial, and that encouraged HBI to settle. Why'd that happen? CRT says that the fact that Judge Beatty was black himself meant that he knew that the consuming public was larger than the random Twitter users that HBI cited, and that he recognized the presumed advantage of white corporate power over a single black athlete. Judge Beatty was a veteran of social protests and political racism. He knew that different people could have different ideas, different perspectives, because he lived a difference every day. Legal scholars Clark and Lester argue that the diversity of the judiciary helps to reflect the diversity of the American population. Different people are more tolerant of different ideas. Clark notes that the lack of diversity leads to inherent bias in the courts. As a nation of laws, we should not defer to white-controlled corporations to decide what is acceptable speech or to decide what is moral. This is a case study of difference. Mendenhall voiced a slightly unusual perspective, and Beatty said he had the right to prove that it was not offensive to the majority of the consuming public. Now, in any such confluence of judgments and interests, it's really impossible to say how racial, or for that matter, any other identity influences the outcome. What CRT and intersectionality, as well as common sense, tells us, though, is that it does influence every aspect of the process. As critical legal studies observes, lived experiences result in different perspectives and different legal outcomes. In this case of an athlete challenging a corporation, we can see the impact of the importance of lived experiences in gaining more nuanced and varied interpretation of the law as well as the world. The Mendenhall case shows us how the American perception and experience of race, particularly, influences every aspect of our society. So, photo credits, thank you, I am out. So, Tracy, what do I do now?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to stop sharing your screen, and I'm going to ask that anyone who has a question can either put up their hands via a reaction. They can start their video and put up their hands as an actual person, or they can post it in the chat, and we will see who might have some questions for you today. Thank you. That was super interesting. I apologize if anybody noticed my dogs going crazy. I'm monitoring the chat. I'm monitoring people's screen on the screen. I'm monitoring. Am I missing anybody? Oh, here we go. Rachel, I have asked you to unmute, Rachel.
Yeah. Okay, I can talk. Sarah, so interesting. Thank you so much. My question is about how you access the agreements between athletes and companies, because often I imagine there was only made public during court cases. So yeah, like what ideas do you have for figuring out how those operate? And when you don't have access to those types of materials, how do you access, what kinds of corporate documents do you find useful?
So that's a great question. And fortunately for me, published court decisions are often a wealth of stuff. So all of this language came out of the decision. Beatty had published it all. Also, in this case, there were a couple of amici curiae briefs that are available on Westlaw that I pulled up, and they too quoted it. I did not schlep through the HBI files or talk to Mendenhall and get copies of the original contracts. I on it all from secondary sources. Some of my legal studies scholars who are better people and more diligent than I will schlep around and do that. I usually rely on what I can find via the internet, and it's a whole different ballgame now than it was when I first started doing this 30 years ago. It's a lot easier to find. See, I know you're all wanting cookies, and you're all thinking about where is that brownie that Karen Fennell would have gotten for me.
It's harder without the snacks. Oh, I got Laura. I'm asking you to unmute, Laura.
So I suspect this is not going to be something that's easy to answer or even that you can, but it makes me curious that was such a politically charged time, or at least ethnically charged time. And I'm curious if there were lots and lots of court cases that came out about people trying to speak their mind about what they thought might have happened, or, I don't know how you do such a search, but is there any sense about how many of these types of cases emerged from that period?
So that's a great question. I can't tell you how many made it to, like, how many got filed, because there's no good tracking system on that. And I can't even tell you how many even would have gone to potentially a jury or at the state level. At the federal level, so far as I can tell, this is the only endorsement that got terminated during that time, because there was no mention of other things going on in the case or in any of the things I could find about it. And I did a broad search through the legal databases, and there were no other published decisions. Doesn't mean there wasn't stuff filed and settled long before it went to trial. That's one of the weaknesses of doing legal studies, is you get stuck. I'm really limited to what gets published, or unless I hear about something or see it in the newspaper, and then I can hunt it down. But it's hard to do a general search over stuff that gets filed, settled, filed, gets to trial, dismissed. Any of those things disappear. But yeah, it was a big enough time. I was a little surprised there weren't more endorsers who got in trouble for what they said. But I couldn't find any record of anybody. Doesn't mean that there weren't, just that I didn't find it.
I'll ask one as someone who has social media as part, well, we all have social media as part of our daily lives at this point, but who has it as part of my professional life. Did this have any reversing of a chilling effect, or any that you know of effect on in broader professional athletics, the freedom that individuals were able to exercise in their social media platforms, or did long-term it not actually end up having much of an impact? Do you know?
That's an excellent question. And it's hard to find causation in this, but there is a correlation. The leagues have gotten looser with their restriction. The professional leagues have gotten looser in the United States on their social media platform restrictions. I don't know that it's linked to this, or if it's just, 10 years down the line, we've adjusted. The colleges have not. Most of the colleges have pretty steep lockdown. That clip I showed you about the social media restrictions, that was Ohio State University's, and I pulled that up 3 days ago. So that is their current. I couldn't go back in time. I think it was even worse in 2011. But yeah, it's we've seen a relaxation among the professional athletes, but the college athletes are still locked down because, you know, that unpaid labor needs even more restrictions than they have now.
Yeah, all kinds of loopholes or non-loopholes there. Lindsay Tollefson is asking in the chat, was there anything about this case study that surprised you or that might cause you to pivot towards a different case study research question?
That's a great question. On the one hand, I am cynical and I want to say that nothing surprises me. On the other hand, I'm also actually kind of naive, and I was surprised by the intensity of kind of all of this and the complexity. One of the things I love about doing this kind of research is going down all of these different rabbit holes and figuring out how all these stories intertwine and connect, both with each other and the broader society. In terms of where I pivot to a different case or a different question, when I start on these, I usually start because there's just something about the case that interests me. And in this case, it was, I was not on social media in 2011. I have no recollection of any of this happening at the time. It was only later when I started looking at athlete activism and I did a law search for athlete termination that I ran across the case. And I'm like, well, this is interesting. This is a kind of activism we don't always think about. And then I started going further into the story because when you read a legal decision, it gives you the name of the judge. It doesn't tell you anything else. So then you have to go do the research and figure out who the judge is. And it's putting this legal story in the broader context that I find super fascinating. I don't know if everybody else does, but I always tell my students in classes that this lawsuit is the most important thing in the world to somebody at one particular moment. And we need to remember that they are people and that this matters to them intensely. And we need to know their stories and that they are more than just the lawsuit. And so that's why I do this stuff.
Awesome. Jamie Carrington asked in the chat, you mentioned that there's been more regulations, rules around athlete social media profiles. Do you think the recent weight room debate caused backlash for those speaking out?
That is a great question. And for those who haven't been following this, the NCAA men's and women's basketball championships are going on right now. And the NCAA very graciously highlighted the inequities between men's and women's basketball and how they're treated in numerous ways. They're giving the men different COVID tests than they are the women. They gave the men better food. They gave the men better swag bags. The men play on courts with the NCAA logos. Basically, they said the women are lucky to play, but there was a young woman at Oregon, a white woman, who used her privilege as being both a star and being white. And she showed clips of the women's weight room, which consisted of 4 dumbbells and 3 yoga mats. And then she went to the men's weight room, which, well, honestly, it's nicer than the Wellness Center at CU Denver, if you've ever been in that. It doesn't have a climbing wall because you can only do so much in a hotel conference room, but it's pretty nice. I don't think there's going to be backlash against that particular athlete, frankly, because of her privilege of being a star, of being a junior, of being at Oregon, which is a school that has, the basketball team has protected particularly the women. So I think that'll be safe. A number of coaches have spoken out as well, but they too are stars. Gino Ariema has won more basketball games than I can't even count as high. Dawn Staley is the coach at the University of South Carolina, and she is I think she's been placed in the Basketball Hall of Fame 3 different times. She's amazing. They're pretty untouchable. Whether it'll change anything, I am more cynical about. So no, I don't think there's going to be a backlash in that way, but in a year or two, you know, they might sneak something in. The NCAA has a long memory, and Emmerit's been around for a long, long time. And I can tell you fun stories about when I worked with him. He did not like me. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. So far, nothing's happened, but will it? Maybe. There might be some quiet stuff put in on the teams. We may discover that next March, the athletes aren't allowed to post anything.
I'm going to refrain from asking you to follow up in any kind of gossipy way on that. Anybody else? I'm looking for hands. I'm looking for reactions. I'm looking in the chat.
Can I thank everybody for coming? I really appreciate it. Again, I know that it's a Zoom, not our favorite thing at this stage. So thanks for coming. Thanks for chatting. I really appreciate it. And thanks again, Pam and Tracy.
Thank you, everybody. Sarah, that was the best Zoom I've had in a long time.
Totally agree. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody hang in there.
Nice to see everyone, even if it's images.
All right, be well, everybody.